Wisdom.
Yeah.
Someone just reminded us that wisdom likes to call.
Yeah.
We're talking about wisdom on our podcast,
Right.
a little foreshadowing.
Right.
But if you are watching the pod, do you notice anything different about one of us? Because I bet you do notice something different about this guy next to me.
Yeah. So, like last time, I felt like you wanted to hear the duck call.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, I don't have my duck call with me.
Man.
So I was like, I'm going to bring the duck call here with
And not
me.
only did you bring
Well, I
duck
brought
call,
the whole duck call holster because there's some folks that have.
Keep it going.
I mean, I've got 3 here, but 2 of these are mallards and one is a Canada goose.
How different sounding are the mallard ones? Will we find out?
Yeah, so this is the one that I said was really bad. So
yeah.
So if you're listening, I don't know how this will come across, but it could be loud. So if you got earpods on or something, maybe you turn it down. I don't know, but so this is the one that was my first one. So. And the guys always gave me a hard time. They're like, they said it didn't sound like a duck. So then I got this one, this trip.
Is that the elite? Yeah.
This is the elite duck call. So. So
That sounds like a duck.
Yeah, and I like lots of times when you know. So there's different techniques. One of the things is like if the ducks are flying towards you, you typically don't call.
Okay.
Because I don't know why if the movement is enough to throw them off or what it is, but typically when they're circling around, like if they're flying right at you and then they'll like circle. Sometimes they circle high overhead. Especially you want it to be windy when you're
windy
because if it's windy, ducks want to get down faster.
Okay.
But if it's not very windy, they'll just glide around and like check you out like 2 or 3 times. Especially mallards are very wary, and then they'll go on. Pintails even worse than mallards; they'll just go on. But anyways, there's different calls for different things. I was just kind of did some, but there's like a comeback call where you're like.
Oh, like they pat, like you want to,
And there's like a feeding call. I don't do the feeding call on that one great because I feel like the errors restrict a little bit, but Clayton does a really good feeding call on his. But
nice.
Yeah, there's wood duck calls.
Wow.
There are pintail calls.
Man.
There's gaddy calls. So there's all types of different calls that someone could bring to the thing.
So eventually, you might follow suit, pick up a call here or there.
Yeah, I keep this on there just for sentimental value, but I might get rid of this one eventually because I probably wouldn't use it. Yeah.
Nice. And like that, we were talking about this a little bit before. To me, you got like so much paracord. You could, if you were like, if you needed to like, climb up a tree,
right.
You're good to go.
You could weave like a little fishing net or something out of it. Yeah,
you could like survive for a while.
Right.
It's pretty cool. Duck calling, and you've got another call on there.
Yeah, so this is a Canada goose call, and it's pretty loud. But so it's like.
Oh yeah.
So.
That sounds like that too. Yeah.
Yeah. If you've ever heard geese flying over, they.
Dude, I hope you shot like so many Canadian geese. There's nothing I hate worse.
We've shot 2. So we average 1 every other year is our average so far. We got 1 on year 1. We got 1 on year 3. So I guess we'll hope for 1 on year 5 next year.
Yeah, specifically the Canada.
Yeah,
geese.
I mean we've gotten 2 geese, period, and they were both Canada geese.
I mean, maybe it's just because they flock to neighborhoods. I feel like they would be the easiest ones to get because they're everywhere at all times. But maybe that's not like in like the middle of nowhere.
Right. So they're suburbanized here, and they land on land, and we're hunting over water.
Yes.
So they roost on water, but then they get up off the water early
and go to neighborhoods,
and then they go to farmlands and eat like planted wheat and stuff like that.
Man,
yeah.
I just hate them so much. Yeah. But just like. You were calling some ducks. Wisdom's calling the simple. Wisdom's calling out. And so we'll continue on in this series on wisdom literature in our Bible. So let's go ahead and take it to the next level. From the heart of the Low Country in South Carolina,
it's the Take 2 podcast, where we take theology to the next level.
Well, we are in lesson or podcast number 2.
Podcast number 2 of wisdom literature.
Like it's going to be a 6-week series.
Yeah.
And today we're looking at the book of Proverbs, getting into it. You know, last week we spent most of our time in Psalms, getting a little lay of the land, some Hebrew poetry, some chiasms, you know.
And I have not written my chiastic poem yet.
Oh, we're all waiting.
But I was thinking about structuring it on the way over because with all the snow and stuff, I actually had extra time, but was more distracted than I normally am. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure we'll talk about studies. I'm sure it was a great week.
It was crazy. Crazy. Yeah.
But if by way of review, the wisdom books are Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. So we're finally getting into Proverbs. You might have been, you know, looking at the series, been like, man, why do we spend so much time in Psalms? We're getting there. But before we get to Proverbs, if we're talking about wisdom literature, it would behoove us to talk about Hokmah.
Hokmah. That's like those little, like the tobacco things that you put. What are those? Those are called like hookahs or hookahs.
Oh, like a hookah. Yeah. Hookah. Yeah. Basically,
it's very similar.
But I'll tell you what, Hebrew. When I see Hebrew characters, I don't know what's going on. I'll be honest.
Yeah.
Not my forte.
Yeah. They're pretty rounded. You know, we spent some time ministering to Burmese folks. And if you've ever looked at Burmese and Thailand letters, that they're very rounded. And I've learned that that's because they wrote them on palm leaves and you couldn't have straight lines because it would split so almost all their letters are rounded. And then, of course, languages that kind of came from like runes would be very straight because you're like carving straight lines in. But this, this seems more rounded than what carving on stone would lend you to think it would be.
That's very true. And this word Hokmah is nothing to do with hookah, but it's the Hebrew word that gets translated wisdom in our scriptures. And what's pretty interesting about it is, I guess, like a lot of Hebrew words. Vague's probably the wrong term, but it can apply to a lot of things.
It's broad.
Broad.
It
That's
can have
the word.
more than one meaning. Yeah.
Yeah. Where I think Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say like the word for day could have more than one meaning.
Yeah. Then we should do a podcast on that at some times. That'd be good. And if you can imagine, I mean, this word is used all throughout the Old Testament, but there's a super high concentration in these wisdom books. I think over 100 times. In Proverbs is 31 chapters. You know, in Ecclesiastes 12 chapters, like 50 times, I don't know what the number is. And then, 25, 30 times in Job. You see this a lot. And if you were to zoom out of these wisdom books, you would see the broad terminology being used. You go to the tabernacle, Exodus 28 through the early 30s. This word Hokmah is not translated wisdom. It's translated skill or ability, referring to people that maybe work with these different jewels or metals, or the women that are spinning. These people have wisdom or ability or skill, which I like seeing that broad use.
Yeah, and I haven't researched this for myself, but I've also heard that it could refer to sharp, like a sharpened tool that is like skilled at cutting. Like if you had a sharp scythe, that it was.
That'd be cool if someone had a scythe.
That. Yeah.
Scythes look pretty cool.
Yeah.
Just go in there and just cut everything. That's interesting because and if you could go down a rabbit hole with not Hokmah, but even the roots, that there's a bajillion different words. And so that wouldn't surprise me. I think in Ezekiel, I ran across a passage that they were talking about, Tyre and Sidon and these people who could row really well. And they had Hokmah, they had skill in the way they would row these ships. And so when we get to the wisdom literature, it's usually translated wisdom. It's usually not a physical ability, but I think thinking of wisdom as a skill is a good way to think about wisdom.
Right. The skill of applying what you probably know to be true.
Yeah.
How do I best apply this knowledge that I have, or how do I best discipline myself? Those types of things.
And I like that. To me, that's empowering because just like any sport or any, playing an instrument, whatever, there are some people that are naturally more talented. But if you work hard enough, you can improve greatly. If you put some time and some effort, you can improve in any skill. And so I like this idea. I think the ESV Study Bible's definition that I drew from said that wisdom is skill in the art of godly living or godliness in action, like those definitions a lot, and that kind of helps set the stage for Proverbs, because we're going to talk about wisdom a lot.
Right. That's good.
When you think of a proverb, what do you think of? What's a good definition for a proverb?
For a single proverb, I would say it's a very pointed saying that normally has some type of hook to it that, it has a catchy way of saying something that helps you remember it.
I think that's good. The short, pithy phrase, like these. When I think of Proverbs, I think of all these little proverbs of, it's packed with a lot, very memorable. You can memorize them, but has a lot of practical advice. What's funny, maybe it's not funny, in this episode that we're recording, we're really not going to talk about any of those, even though I think that comes to our mind so readily when we think of Proverbs. We want to set the stage, see how this book is framed, because these pithy sayings don't start till chapter 10.
Yeah.
There's a lot of the book of Proverbs before we get to these, what I think of when I think of Proverbs. And we love Proverbs because it's practical. A criticism that I have heard, or as you read, probably maybe from scholars that are not Christian, that read the Bible as literature only, they kind of look at it and say, man, Proverbs is practical, but it's kind of too practical. You can read it, and because it doesn't mention the temple or sacrifices or covenants, kind of seems secular, kind of seems like karma. Do good, good things will happen. Do bad, bad things will happen. And you can read some of these Proverbs, and you can come away thinking that if you just look at a few Proverbs, you know what I mean?
So they're lodging that criticism, like they think it's a book written by man. And
exactly.
And that it's falling short of what it should be.
Yeah, they're like, it just so out of place. You read any other book, and it seems like it's developing theology. And you read Proverbs, and you can read certain passages, and it just seems moralistic. It seems like, how does this fit in with the rest of Scripture? And I'll pull up maybe some Proverbs that's come to my mind when I hear a criticism like that, because I think I've got it in my PowerPoint from my Sunday school, but I'm looking at it right now and seeing what kind of comes to my mind, which ones that I would exactly be thinking of. But I am not finding it off the top of my head here. And I've got, when you ever make a lesson that has like a bajillion slides and you're just like scrolling forever and ever. I think that's where I am. I'm finding myself right now. So it is a criticism. Wish I had.
So you're just looking for one that's like very just on the horizontal level. It's not really vertical.
Exactly. Yeah. I'll go to my actual notes. I bet I can find them. But there were a few that you read and you're like, oh, that's really good common sense.
So maybe 10:5. He who gathers in summer is a son who acts wisely, but he who sleeps in harvest is a son who acts shamefully. Like,
exactly.
Like that's common sense. Like you gotta make hay while the sun's shining is what we would say today.
That's exactly right. And you can read things like that. Here's someone. Hey, I found my notes. Wealth brings many new friends, but a poor man is deserted by his friends. Got money, people flock to you. You don't, people won't. Good news refreshes the bones. Give good news to people. That's good. Desire without knowledge is not good, but whoever makes haste with his feet misses his way. And you could find a bunch of these. You just turned to Proverbs and found some where it seems to reflect some good common sense, but it's really devoid of, some theological thinking. And so my point in starting with just the bookends of Proverbs, not these short, pithy phrases and sayings and couplets, is let's look at how the rest of the book is set. Like what starts the book, what ends the book, because that gives us a lot of context that, I think the middle of the book's got plenty of context too, but this really drives home the point that it's definitely, no matter what you say, you can't say it's secular.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and you're not saying that the beginning and end isn't poetry or in verse. It's just not those kind of short standalone statements. There's kind of a unifying theme of those verses in those opening chapters when, I don't want to steal thunder ahead, but when Solomon is kind of talking to what appears to be his son.
No, you're exactly right. And, a lot of the ways, if you look at outlines, it'll say, chapters 1 through 9 and chapters 31 in particular. Some people say 30 and 31, amazingly 31. That's really longer Hebrew poems. And then everything in the middle is what they call short sayings or couplets or quads. It's not really what you think of as a unified poem. Like 1 through 9 is like, you can read these, these are speeches or poems.
Right.
And so it is a little bit different. And it's pretty amazing that, there's 9 chapters. It's like pretty extensive, developing this before we even get to these Proverbs. So maybe a good place to start out is this preamble that, we probably heard talked about several times, but Proverbs 1 and maybe those first 7 verses.
So you're saying start at the very beginning?
It's this revolutionary idea. Start beginning, see what happens.
That's a very good place to start. That's a quote from Sound of Music. So.
Oh, I didn't know that. Great. Yeah. That's good. I love it. You want to just read those 7 verses for us?
Yeah, it says, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction.
Very, very good. A lot of terms we could spend a lot of time on. Opens up. I like the way Proverbs is laid out. Opens up saying these are the Proverbs of Solomon. You got the title right there.
Yeah.
And then it's purpose
You wish
statement.
some other books of the Bible had said that.
Tell me like the author, the title, and then your explicit purpose right at the beginning. That just makes it all easy.
Yeah, like author of Hebrews. Come on.
Looking at you. Yeah, come on, man. And its purpose, we see in verse 2, we kind of get to the point, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing and righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. And so we've got all of these wisdom terms kind of packaged together. The first word, wisdom, we talked about that, hokmah. Second word, instruction, often accompanies wisdom, and is this word that maybe has this a little bit more stern, a little bit harsher correction, maybe used in conjunction with things like corporal punishment. But it's teaching someone going astray and kind of getting them on the right path. That these Proverbs were written to do that, to kind of align your life, give you some instruction. Also, we see this word, understand, has this idea of distinguishing between right and wrong, looking at relationships and teasing out, correct moral judgments. A couple other words, we'll go quickly through this so we don't get down, too bogged down in the weeds. But in verse 3, we come across wise dealing, and in verse 4 we come across this word prudence. They're not the same word, but they go together a lot, and I think they both speak to foresight, strategic planning. And what's interesting here, we see that wise dealing is based in righteousness, justice, and equity. A lot of these wisdom terms, especially prudence and wise dealing, they're really neutral words. And they're either connected with something moral, like righteousness, and then it's wise dealing, or it's something negative, and it's being cunning or subtle or deceitful or scheming.
Yeah, because you could have a skill and then decide how you're going to use that skill.
That's exactly right. We read about the serpent in Genesis 3. Some of these words are the same words used of him, but he's crafty because it's not prudence in that same way.
Yep, that's good.
And then we get to the audience. It's written to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. We see, you mentioned this, a father talking to his son, someone with less life experience, maybe more open to enticement, or kind of has to make a decision, and he's not firmly planted in his ways. That's, a lot of who Proverbs is written towards. Also written for the wise to hear and increase in learning, for someone, with understanding to get some guidance. And then we get to really the crux of it. If you've heard anything about Proverbs, you've probably heard verse 7 about the fear of the Lord, a phrase that we see over and over and over again.
Yeah. No, that's good. And there's also places that says the fool has said in his heart there is no God. Is that may be a proverb or a psalm, or it may have appeared in a couple places, but it's kind of like the restating of the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge and wisdom. If you don't have the fear of the Lord, or if you reject it, then you're kind of on the opposite of that.
Ooh, yeah, that's good, because that's going to be the theme. It's kind of like Psalm 1. You're going righteous, you're going wicked. Make your choice. And to your point, when we look at this word fool, there are a variety of Hebrew words that could be translated for fool. One is Nabal that we see in this story, right?
Great name. I mean, I was listening to this lesson. I was like, what parent named their child Nabal or Nabal or however it's pronounced?
That's probably it.
What a
that's great. And it's like, oh man, that's not what you want. Another one of these Hebrew words, kesel, means dull or thick-headed. The idea is wrong decisions are made not because you're not smart, but because you don't listen. You're kind of set in your ways. Another one, ewil, I'm probably saying these Hebrew words wrong, just refers to a moral deficiency, lack of self-control, typically seen in speech or temper or that kind of thing. So that really sets the stage for the rest of this lengthy introduction. The rest of chapters 1 through 9 are really 10 or 11 lectures. Kind of depends on how you categorize them, of a father talking to a son. And what we also see are these little interludes in between where Lady Wisdom is calling out in the streets. She's in the marketplace. She's setting a banquet. And so...
Does she have elite duck call with her when she's calling out?
I don't know what translation this is, but I think I did see that in one of these translations.
Maybe the Message or something.
Something like that. The Hunter's Bible. You see all these theme Bibles.
Right. Yeah.
That's
that
great.
would be good. She's got her mallard call calling out. Will anyone listen to me?
Oh, that is so good. Yeah, that's great. So you've got these lectures from a father to a son, and there's a bunch of different themes that he hits, but over and over and over again, you can kind of boil down his lectures to two things. He's saying, son, avoid these pitfalls. They are going to take you off the path of wisdom. These are foolishness. These are folly. And then he keeps reminding his son, wisdom is good. Here are some benefits of wisdom. If you pursue wisdom, you can expect all of these other good things to go along with it.
Who do you think he was talking to? Not Rehoboam.
Yeah, I didn't think about this like that.
I mean, do you think he's talking to an actual literal son of his, or do you think it's like son in the abstract that he's writing these down?
Man, yeah, that's a really good question. That's a great question to think through with all of the many children that I'm sure he had. Who is this directed towards? And I'd be interested to understand more about how this book was compiled ultimately, because it seems like there's a bunch of different collections, stemming from Solomon, but who this was too. Yeah. You're like, come on, Rehoboam. Let's get it. Let's get it together. And this is probably worth noting too, the foolish obstacles that he tells his son to avoid. There's a lot of different things, but over and over again, he talks about, don't try to make easy money through unjust ways by joining the wicked and taking advantage of someone, or hurting someone, or murdering someone. And then the other side is avoid this easy, casual, non-committal sex. That is going to be a major pitfall that's going to distract you from what's important.
And when you were researching this, I'm assuming that this is written towards the end of Solomon's life, or is it beginning, middle? Do we know? Before or after the 700 wives is really what I want to know.
Yeah, that's a good question. Exactly where in Solomon's life? I mean, you would assume it might be when he's got all this wisdom, or
early on.
Maybe more early on.
And then Ecclesiastes happens towards the end of his life, you think?
Yeah.
Where he's kind of more looking back like, man, I did everything and nothing satisfied.
Yeah, I think there's something there. And maybe we can look at this when we talk about Ecclesiastes. There's also some like weird phraseology in there where he's like, I had more than all the kings in Jerusalem before me. And you're like, David? You're talking about the Saul? One king? Yeah. And Saul didn't even rule in Jerusalem.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's like, that's a weird thing to say.
Well, there is that thought that there were the kings of Salem.
That's true. So maybe he's thinking of that. That's a good point too. Yeah. Because that's usually, there's a couple phrases like that where you're like, it's kind of weird. And then it's like, half of it's, we're not talking about Ecclesiastes, but it's like, oh, it's royalty, but it seems like half of this stuff's not royal. I don't know. It is a good... Yeah. And then he doesn't say Solomon in there. It's weird that Solomon's named in Song of Songs and in Proverbs, but not in Ecclesiastes. That's the Kohelet. But things we can talk about.
Teacher.
That exactly right. Yeah. So back to Proverbs. Maybe we'll touch briefly on these 4 teachings of Lady Wisdom, these interludes. She's just calling out to the simple, like, man, go with me. And a big point she's making is, there is a creator in this world. Wisdom is an attribute of creation. Maybe we can talk about this. I don't know if you've got a strong take on Proverbs 8. There's this debate.
The chapter,
yes. Specifically verses 22 maybe through 31 or something like that, where it talks about wisdom being with God at creation, essentially. Where some would say, hey, this is an attribute of God being personified. I think I would probably fall there. And then others would say, no, this is an actual hypostasis. Like this is not just a foreshadowing of Jesus. This is Jesus. Because of some of the language, there's some translation challenges here with how you want to word things, So anyway, this is actually a proof text Arius took to the Council of Nicaea and said, yeah, Jesus is divine, but he's not God because Proverbs 8.
Right.
So anyway, it's been a debate for a long time.
I never have read through that and thought, oh, that's a Christology there. I think I've read through it and kind of scratched my head and gone, I guess this is just a characteristic of God, of God that's been personified. That's probably where I've landed reading it. Even if it were some type of Christology here, not Christology. What's the word?
Like Christophany.
Not the study of Christ, but the appearance of Christ. If it were a Christophany, I wouldn't use figurative verse as what I'm going to lean in on to try to determine like the real, precise properties of the second person of the Trinity. I'd use maybe some didactic teaching from the New Testament when it's more fully revealed.
No, I think that's good, and I don't want to slander Arius. Maybe this was like a supporting text, not as primary, but I know this was like debated because if you do look at
where's Saint Nick when you need him, I'm saying.
Come on, Saint Nick. A lot of the early church, you look at it like Justin Martyr and Origen and these people, they would say this is a Christophany. Yeah. But then shortly after that, I think Saint Augustine, so these people are like, well, it's probably a personified attribute. It's hard to go farther than that.
Yeah. Just thinking back, when I was an early new believer and like on fire, like it's easy to see things like Christ is everything. So maybe right after Christ comes out, like they're like, finding, these Old Testament passages and being excited about and like actively looking for places where they missed, Christ some places. And maybe that led them to be a little bit more overeager to see him in places that maybe he wasn't really.
Yeah, I think there's something to that regardless of, I think there's good people on both sides of this. The point is that there's a creator who utilized wisdom in creation. Because of that, there is order and logic and rationale, and things are orderly. There are patterns in this world. There's a cause and effect to a lot of things we do. It might not be totally boiled down to being that simple, but we definitely see a deed-consequence relationship.
Yeah, I think there are general patterns of life that if you get up and work hard and are respectful of your employer, you're probably going to do well. Is it guaranteed you're going to be rich? Is it going to guarantee you against some calamity? No. If you're, sleep all the time and you're drinking a lot of wine, you're probably not going to do well. Does that guarantee that you didn't get left a lot of money? No. So there are these exception cases, but we're talking about the usual way things work in life.
I think that is so good. And then, and maybe the last part of our podcast here, I'm going to jump to the whole other end of the book. We're looking at the bookends. Let's briefly look at chapters 30 and 31. My guys Agur and King Lemuel, everyone's favorite Bible characters.
Yeah.
And what's so unique about...
I'm surprised they didn't make it on the basketball teams, really.
We need to do a redraft one of these days. What we see is how the book ends. And to me, it seems like a definitive unit because there's so much similarity in these last two chapters where both of these authors are clearly non-Jewish. They're not Israelites.
Yeah. And I was listening to this because I'm in the lots of times I'm in the sound booth.
Okay,
so I haven't been actually in your class. So I have to listen to it afterwards because I probably would have asked you this during class. Yeah. But the words of Lemuel are the Proverbs 31 woman. Are they also attributed to him, or is that a separate section that added on later?
So this is debated, and so the two sides. People say, "Oh, the Proverbs 31 woman, it's definitely different." Mm-hmm. So it looks different. However, I think every section of Proverbs kind of is a word. It kind of has a author associated. So this would be the only part of Proverbs that is like an orphan. Like it doesn't, which is not saying it couldn't happen.
Right.
But so you got people on both sides saying, hey, it's different in the way it seems like a different type of writing, but it's not identified with someone, and like every other part of Proverbs is.
Right.
So,
yeah.
I don't know.
Because I think a lot of people talk about it being Solomon
closing it out,
but I don't know.
Yeah.
Who knows?
It depends on who you ask. Where I think there's good arguments because.
Right. Sorry to distract you from Agur and Lemuel.
You're good. We don't really have time to develop everything, but it's really fascinating looking at there's translation issues, especially the words of Agur beginning. Like, what's he trying to say? I think the NASB translates much different than the ESV. And so it's just interesting, some of this stuff. But all that to say, the words of Agur start out saying this is an oracle. The words of King Lemuel say that too. So two non-Jewish people starting out with oracles. The way they start their writings are pretty similar. And they both, being non-Jews, appeal to special revelation in some capacity. We see Agur saying he's been looking for wisdom everywhere. He's weary. He's worn out. He grew up not a Jew. He didn't have knowledge of the Holy One.
And did he convert?
And I would assume that he did based on this. I don't think we've got a lot of information on him. But then he, as he's talking, he kind of sounds a lot like Job. He says, who's ascended to heaven and come down? Who's gathered the wind in his fist? Who's done this? Who's done that? Really, only one has done that, and that would be God. And he shifts to saying every word of God proves true. We get to this point where in verses 7 through 9, I think this is the only prayer recorded in Proverbs. Really good prayer about not having too much, not having too little. And then some would even say things kind of change from here, and maybe this is not Agur. This is different. Mm-hmm. Kind of the same thing with King Lemuel. Like the second half looks different. Right. And we've got these really weird, I didn't talk about this in the class, but these really weird there's 3 things that are wonderful or whatever, and 4 things that are hard. And those are fun to go through and talk through because they're, I think, pretty interesting, talking about a lot of general revelation, talking a lot about the created order and things going on there. But the point I want to point out is, it both kind of ends talking about the importance of Scripture, and then Proverbs 31 in second to last verse talks about a woman who fears the Lord. It's really the embodiment of this wisdom that we see at the beginning, and we're closing out that way. So everything's kind of just immersed in the fear of the Lord. It's immersed in, you can be wise and walk in the fear of the Lord, or you can be foolish and do your own thing. And that's really the context. The middle section, these short, pithy sayings, it sits right in between those things. Yeah, and if we're walking in the fear of the Lord, that should motivate us to choose wisely, which, I think there is an aspect of fear that is a healthy, respectful fear that we can have, and an awe of him being our creator. But then that should help us to do exactly what Proverbs is meant to do, is to, make these choices that we kind of know to be good and to be reminded of, but it helps us to be, wise and discerning in our living. No, I think that's good. And I'll briefly say, it's really hard. We'll talk about this maybe next time. It's hard to tease out some of these blessings we get, these benefits of wisdom. It's hard to tease out the spiritual from the physical. They're all kind of wrapped together here. But the Father talking to the Son basically says, hey, if you choose wisdom, you're going to have prosperity. You're going to have security. You'll be content. You'll have a long life. You'll have good relationships with God and man. You'll have well-being. You should have good health. Again, not saying this is like definitive, but these are all things the Father's saying. If you do this, you can expect all of those things. Sounds like a pretty good list. Right. No, that's good. All right, very good. Any final thoughts on Proverbs, the bookends and the structure and layout? I think that is all. take time, read through those together, because I think I'm always just like chomping at the bit to get into these like short, pithy sayings, but it's good to think about these larger sections. But that's all I got.
So next Thursday, we'll get into that.
There we go. Love it. Yes.
All right. That's our take.
Thanks for listening to Take Two. Find us wherever you find podcasts and on YouTube for those who want to watch our video cast.